The air smelled of oil paint and turpentine in Gabriel's workshop. Unfinished canvases leaned against the walls, some with vibrant strokes of color, others with only half-finished sketches. The dim evening light came in through the large window, casting shadows on the worn wooden floor. Despite the chaotic beauty of the space, he felt empty. Sitting in his armchair with a brush in his hand, he looked at the painting he had been working on for weeks. A technically impeccable work, with a perfect chromatic balance and an attractive composition. However, he didn't say anything to her. I didn't speak to him. He sighed and dropped the brush on the table. His studio was full of paintings that seemed to express something, but contained nothing of him. It was as if he painted for others, not for himself. Since he was a child, art had been his refuge. He remembered the afternoons drawing in the patio of his house, when there were still no worries or expectations. His early paintings had been raw, impulsive, full of genuine emotion. But over time, as he grew up and sought success, he began to mold himself into what others expected of him. Gabriel had achieved recognition in the art world. His exhibitions always attracted buyers, his paintings sold at high prices, and his name was mentioned in specialized magazines. But none of that made him feel complete. His phone vibrated on the table. It was a message from his agent. The gallery wants more works along the same lines as the last exhibition. They loved your style. You have a month. Gabriel felt a knot in his stomach. Your style. But what was his style? He stood up suddenly and began pacing around the studio, restless. He looked at each painting with a mixture of frustration and exhaustion. They were all beautiful, but none of them were him. He was an artist without identity, an echo of what the market was asking for. "Damn!" he exclaimed, throwing a paintbrush to the ground. His breathing was labored. He felt a growing anguish. It had lost its essence. He sank into a chair, his head in his hands. How had he gotten there? When had he stopped painting with his heart and started manufacturing paintings, as if they were mass-produced products? Suddenly, a memory crossed his mind. An old painting teacher that he had met years before, when he was studying at the university. Don Machis, a man with a slow voice and deep gaze, who always spoke about art as if it were an act of self-knowledge. Gabriel remembered a phrase of his: "If you don't find yourself in your art, then you are just imitating someone else's life." The memory shook him. What if that was the key? Maybe there was someone who could help him out of this crisis. Maybe Don Machis had the answers that he couldn't find on his own. He stood up decisively. "I couldn't continue like this. If you wanted to recover your voice, your identity, your essence, he had to look for answers within himself, or in whoever knew how to do it." And with that thought, he took the keys to his study and left. Gabriel's routine had become a monotonous sequence of brushstrokes and transactions. Paint, exhibit, sell. It was an endless cycle, like a cog within a machinery that never stopped. Every morning, he woke up, drank black coffee, and locked himself in his workshop. He spent hours in front of the canvases, repeating the same old patterns, the same colors that he knew worked, the same compositions that his audience expected. Art, once his refuge, now felt like a prison. When he finished a work, his agent, Marta, I stopped by his studio to review his work. I always had the same reaction: incredible, Gabriel. This series will sell out in a matter of days. He nodded with a weak smile. I knew that Marta was only telling the truth. His paintings, they sold well. His exhibitions were filled with collectors eager to take a piece of his. Every time he launched a new collection, people congratulated him profusely. Your style is unmistakable. You have created a unique brand. Your works have a special aura. But Gabriel didn't feel anything. Every praise felt like an empty echo. People talked about his artistic identity, but he himself didn't know what that meant. What was his identity really? He did not recognize his soul in his own works. Marta noticed his lack of enthusiasm and frowned. Gabriel, are you okay? Lately I see you distracted. Yeah, sure. I'm just tired, he lied. She looked at him skeptically. Rest if you need it, but don't disconnect. We are at a crucial moment for your career. The gallery in New York is still interested in your work. We just have to keep up the pace. Keep the rhythm. As if it were a machine. Yes, I know. Gabriel felt himself sinking deeper into the character he had built for the world. The successful artist. The man who had a career on the rise. But deep inside, he felt like an imposter. That night, he decided to go out to clear his head. He met his best friend, Santiago, in a small bar in the city. Santiago was a photographer. With a raw and authentic perspective on art, he had always been the first to tell her the truth, even when she didn't want to hear it. You seem strange, brother. Santiago narrowed his eyes as he took a sip of beer. It's been a while since I've seen you excited about what you do. Gabriel stirred the ice in his glass with a spoon. Avoiding his friend's gaze, I'm fine. I just ... I have a lot of things on my mind. Santiago rested his elbows on the table and watched him in silence for a few seconds before speaking. Don't fuck with me. I know you. You are not happy. Gabriel felt a knot in his stomach. I didn't have an answer. After a long silence, Santiago sighed. You are successful, Gabriel. Why aren't you happy? Gabriel swallowed. His mind tried to find a logical answer, a justification, but found nothing. Finally, he murmured, don't know. It was the first time he had admitted it out loud. Santiago nodded slowly, as if waiting for that answer. Then there is a problem, brother. Because art without happiness is just business. The words hit Gabriel like a gust of cold wind. Was that what he had done? Turn your art into an empty business? That night, when he arrived at his apartment, he sat in front of a blank canvas and forced himself to face the question he had avoided for so long. Who am I really painting for? I had no answer, but I knew I had to find her. The sound of the taxi engine mixed with the hum of the city. Gabriel looked out the window as the buildings passed him in blurs. His mind was somewhere else, caught up in the question Santiago had thrown at him the night before. You are successful. Gabriel, why aren't you happy? I didn't know the answer. But something inside him told him that he needed to look for her, and he knew exactly who he should talk to. After many years, he decided to visit Don Mayas, his former teacher. Don Mayas had been an enigmatic figure in Gabriel's life. At university, he was not just a professor, but a man who understood art from a deeper place. While other teachers talked about technique and market, he talked about soul and truth. Gabriel remembered his words. The painting is a mirror. But if the artist doesn't know who he is, he will only see a blurry image. At that time, Gabriel had not understood the real meaning of that phrase. Now more than ever, he felt that his reflection in art was a distorted shadow. The taxi stopped in front of a stone house covered in vines. He got out of the car with his heart pounding. He hadn't seen his teacher in years. Would you remember? He approached the wooden door and knocked gently. After a few seconds, slow footsteps were heard. The door opened a little and appeared Don Mayas with his white beard and serene look. His eyes shone with the same intensity, Gabriel remembered. The old man watched him in silence and, after a moment, smiled wistfully. I knew that one day you would return. Gabriel felt a lump in his throat. I need to talk to you. Teacher, I know happens. The interior of Don Mayas' house was a different world. There was no luxury or ostentation, just true art. The walls were covered with paintings that seemed to have a life of their own. They were paintings full of raw emotion, history, essence. They were not pieces designed to be sold. They were pieces made for exist. Gabriel looked around the space, feeling a strange mixture of admiration and nostalgia. When was the last time you had painted something like that? They sat at a worn wooden table. The teacher poured 2 cups of coffee without haste. Gabriel took a breath before speaking. I feel like I'm not me in my art. I don't know what I'm painting. The words came out heavier than he expected. Don Mayhis observed him calmly, as if he already knew what was happening to him. You've forgotten who you are, he said softly. Gabriel frowned. No, I haven't forgotten. I'm just going through a hard time. The old man smiled with a hint of irony. Who are you, Gabriel? Silence settled in the room. Gabriel opened his mouth, but he didn't have an answer. He was a painter, yes, but what else? He was a successful man, but did that define him? He was someone recognized in the art world, but did you really know each other? He felt a chill. Double, he stammered. Don't know. Don Mayhis nodded calmly, as if that were the correct answer. There's your problem. Gabriel felt something break inside him. All his life he had believed that art was his identity, but now he understood that it was not that simple. The art, it was not the identity itself. It was the reflection of identity. If he didn't know who he was, then his art wouldn't know either. Don Mayhis got up and walked to one of his paintings. It was a chaotic landscape with intense colors and torn brushstrokes. When I painted this, he said, I was at my worst. My wife had died. My world had collapsed. Gabriel looked at him in silence. I didn't paint to sell. I didn't paint to please anyone. I painted because I needed to get it out of my soul. And that is why this work is honest. She turned to look directly at him. Tell me, Gabriel, when was the last time you painted something that came from you and not from what the world expects? Gabriel felt an emptiness in his stomach. I couldn't remember the answer. Don Mayhis smiled gently. Then you know why you're here. The room was silent. Only the faint aroma of coffee and oil filled the air as Gabriel continued to digest Don Mayhis' words. When was the last time you painted something that came from you and not from what the world expects? I had no answer. Old man watched him patiently, as if waiting for something inside him to awaken. Then, after a few seconds of reflection, he took his cup of coffee and spoke in a calm voice. Gabriel, tell me something. Have you ever heard the term individuation? Gabriel frowned. I think so, but I'm not sure what it means exactly. Don Mayhis smiled, as if that answer seemed familiar to him. It's a concept from Carl Jung, and if you really want to get your art back, you need to understand it. Gabriel leaned forward slightly, intrigued. Explain it to me. The old man put his cup down and laced his fingers in his lap. Individuation is the process of becoming who you really are. Not who society expects you to be, not who you think you should be to fit in, but who you are in the depths of your being. Gabriel felt a chill run down the back of his neck. And what does that have to do with my art? Don Mayhis smiled lightly. It has to do with all. He calmly stood up and walked over to an old painting hanging on the wall. It was a strange and powerful image, a human figure emerging from the shadows, as if it were being born from itself. When you were a child, Gabriel, how did you paint? He didn't respond immediately. His mind traveled to those years when art was his refuge. He painted what he felt, without wondering if it was right, without worrying about whether he liked it or not. He painted without fear, he whispered. Don Mayhis nodded. Exact, because the children haven't built a mask yet. They are authentic. But as we grow, the world tells us what we should be. It shapes us. We learn to act, to please, to fit in. And in that process, we lose parts of ourselves. Gabriel felt a knot in his stomach. So. I have been painting from my mask and not from my true self. Don Mayhis looked at him with satisfaction. You are understanding. He walked over to an old bookshelf and pulled out a notebook with scribbled notes. He opened it and pointed to an underlined sentence. Authentic art can only be born when the artist is in contact with his unconscious. Gabriel read the sentence several times. What does that mean? Don Mayhis smiled and instead of answering, walked to the window. He pointed to a small lake near his house, the waters of which were calm. Your art is like a reflection in a lake. he said in a slow voice. If the water is agitated by external's expectations, pressure, validation, picture will be confusing and distorted. But when the lake is calm, you can clearly see who you really are. Gabriel felt something inside him click. All his life, he had let the market, the public, and his own need for success stir the waters of his art. He had never stopped to look at his reflection honestly. So, if I want to find my true artistic voice, first you have to find yourself, Don Maches completed. Gabriel closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of those words. I knew I had just walked through a door I couldn't close. This was not just an artistic problem, it was something deeper. It was his entire life, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. The fresh wind came through the window of Don Maches' study, gently moving the curtains. Gabriel was still sitting in front of the wooden table, his head full of thoughts. His teacher's words continued to echo in his mind. If you want to find your true artistic voice, you first have to find yourself. Don Maches looked at him calmly and slid a blank canvas in front of him. Surface. Gabriel looked at him, confused. Paint what? The old man smiled patiently. That's the wrong question. It's not about what one paint, but of what needs to be painted. Gabriel frowned. I don't understand. Don Maches leaned towards him. Before painting, look within yourself for what needs to be expressed. Don't think about what will sell, what they expect from you, what is acceptable. Just close your eyes and listen. Gabriel swallowed. Listen within yourself. He couldn't remember the last time he had done it. Try it. The artist took a brush and held it between his fingers. He looked at the blank canvas. Wait. Nothing. An uncomfortable emptiness settled in his chest. For the first time in years, I didn't know what to paint. He tried to visualize colors, shapes, figures, but everything felt foreign. His mind was blank, a blockage. He sighed, putting the brush aside. Can single quotes D. Don Maches observed him with a calm expression. Because Gabriel rubbed his forehead. Don't know. I just don't know what should come out of me. The old man smiled knowingly. Then it's time to start digging. Ghosts of the past. Gabriel closed his eyes and tried to concentrate. Listen within yourself. At first, he only felt noise. His mind jumped from one thought to another. The dates of his next exhibitions, his agent's expectations, the public's comments on his work. But when he allowed himself to go deeper, they began to appear echoes of the past. A blurry memory formed in his mind. Him, as a child, painting enthusiastically in his room. His hands stained with colors, his heart beating with emotion. He created worlds. Then, painting was his refuge, his truth, his joy. Suddenly the image changed. His father appeared at the door. Tall, imposing, cold. That's fine for playing, he said in a hard voice. But in real life, being an artist is not a job. Gabriel felt the blow of those words. Even after so many years. It's not a real job. The memory faded and was replaced by another. He was now a teenager, excitedly showing a painting to his mother. An abstract, chaotic piece, full of energy. She smiled, but not with pride, but with condescending softness. It's nice, but couldn't you make something more saleable? Something that people want to hang in their living room. Gabriel felt the air in his chest tighten. Make something that people want to buy. His eyes snapped open, his breathing heavy. Shit. Don Maches looked at him with a slight smile. What did you see? Gabriel felt a lump in his throat. All my life, my art has been conditioned. By whom? He took a breath. For my father, who never believed this was a real profession. For my mother, who always wanted me to do something commercial. Because of the market, because of the pressure, because of the need for success. His own words weighed on his tongue. He leaned forward and grabbed his head with his hands. For the first time, he saw clearly the invisible chains that had directed every stroke of his life. Then you understand why you can't paint, Don Maches said calmly. Because you have never allowed yourself to paint from yourself. You have always been painting for others. The words struck like lightning in Gabriel's chest. It was true. His entire career had been a response to external expectations. He closed his eyes and felt something inside him break. A deep fear rose in his chest. If he eliminated all those influences, if he painted only from his truth, what would be left of him? I didn't have the answer, but for the first time, he knew he had to find her. The nights began to become restless for Gabriel. Since he opened the door to his past, his dreams became strangely vivid. They were not normal dreams. They were like messages that his unconscious was sending him, forcing him to look deep inside himself. That night, while he was sleeping in the guest room of Don Macias' house, sleep caught him again. He was in a long, cold hallway, with gray walls and no windows. In his hands, he held a brush and a palette full of colors. In front of him, a large blank canvas hung in the middle of the void. He felt an uncontrollable urge to paint, as if his life depended on it. He slid the brush over the fabric and the color began to emerge. But something strange happened. As soon as he advanced a few brush strokes, the figures began to fade, as if the canvas absorbed them. Gabriel tried to paint faster, but every time I thought I had captured something real, the image disappeared. Desperation took hold of him. It was as if nothing he created had any value, as if everything fell apart before he could complete it. Suddenly, he realized that he was no longer alone. Around him, blurry shadows watched him. Their faces were indistinguishable, but their voices were familiar. "It's not a real job." A tall figure muttered, "Make something more saleable." Whispered another, "You are successful. Why aren't you happy?" Gabriel covered his ears. I didn't want to hear more. Ran. The hallway transformed into an endless labyrinth. Every time he turned a corner, a new blank canvas awaited him, only to watch his art disappear again and again. Fear took over him. I had no way out, until a last shadow emerged from the bottom of the labyrinth. It was his own reflection. But it wasn't him as he looked now. It was a younger Gabriel, his eyes full of rage and sadness. His shadow spoke to him with a voice that seemed to come from his own soul. "If everything you paint disappears, maybe it's because it was never yours." Gabriel woke up with a gasp. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his skin covered in cold sweat. He put his hands to his face, trying to calm himself. That dream wasn't just a dream. It was a message. When he came down to breakfast, Don Macias noticed his altered expression. "Bad night?" he asked with a slight smile. Gabriel rubbed his temples. "I had a dream. Strange." The old man poured him a cup of coffee and sat down in front of him. "Tell me." Gabriel told him everything. The labyrinth, the canvases that disappeared, the shadows that watched him, his younger reflection speaking to him. Don Macias nodded slowly, as if everything made sense. "That labyrinth," he said quietly, "it's you." Gabriel felt a chill. "As?" The old man took a sip of coffee and looked at him calmly. Jung called shadow the part of us that we repress. They are all those desires, fears and truths that we hide because they scare us, or because the world has taught us that we should not show them. He paused before continuing. "Your shadow is that child who once painted freely, but who learned to enclose his art in the expectations of others. And now he's chasing you because he wants to be seen." Gabriel felt a lump in his throat. "So, is that why everything I painted in my dream disappeared?" Don Macias nodded. "Because it wasn't yours. It was what you thought it should be. Your real art, the one that comes from your essence. You have not found it yet." Gabriel closed his eyes, feeling the weight of those words. "And how do I get out of that maze?" Don Macias smiled knowingly. "Facing your shadow, accepting what you have repressed. Painting, not for others, but for yourself." Gabriel clenched his fists. I knew the road wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that he couldn't continue running away from himself. It was time to face what I had always avoided. Gabriel locked himself in the study with a determination he had never felt before. It was time to face his truth. Don Machut's words echoed in his head. Your real art, the one that comes from your essence, you have not found it yet. He took a canvas and placed it in front of him. His hands shook as he grabbed the brushes. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about what his agent wanted, what the market was asking for, what would be well received by the public. Would paint for him, but what? He closed his eyes and let his mind travel to his childhood. A memory emerged. I was 6 years old. He was sitting on the floor of his room, surrounded by crayons. He drew with an almost feverish intensity. His hand moved without fear, without restrictions. Each stroke came out pure, without censorship. When he finished, he stood back to observe him better. He had drawn a dark forest. Twisted trees, shadows that seemed to move between them, a small figure in the center, himself, lost in the gloom. He felt proud. It was the first time I had drawn something so powerful. He ran to show it to his mother. She took the paper and looked at it in silence for a few seconds. Then his expression changed. This is very somber, Gabriel. Why don't you draw something prettier? Something with happy colors. Something that we can put in the living room. Gabriel looked down. But that's how I see it. She sighed and folded the drawing. Better save it. You don't have to show this to anyone, okay? He nodded. And that was the first time he learned to hide his truth. Gabriel opened his eyes. The memory left a void in his chest. All his life he had been repressing a part of himself. Art was not only beauty, harmony, and light. It was also chaos, shadows, raw emotions. But he had learned to hide that part because he feared not being accepted. His breathing quickened. He took a paintbrush and without thinking, he started painting. Colors burst forth with fury. Black, red, gray, deep blue. His hand moved uncontrollably, as if something inside him was screaming to get out. I wasn't looking for balance. I wasn't looking for it to be pretty. For the first time, he was letting out what he really felt. Time became irrelevant. I didn't know if hours or minutes passed. When he finally put down the brush, he took a step back and looked at the work. It was chaotic, visceral, heartbreaking. A dark forest, twisted trees, lurking shadows, and in the center himself, a little boy with a look of fear and determination. It was the same drawing from his childhood. But this time, no one could tell him to hide it. He stared at it and felt something deep move inside him. Release. But also fear. Because, for the first time in his career, he was afraid to show his own work. He remained motionless for long minutes. What if no one understood it? What if they judged him? What if, after so much time, he discovered that his truth wasn't worth it? Cold sweat ran down his back. The success he had built was based on another identity. If he showed this, if he revealed his true art, maybe everything would fall apart. He swallowed. He called Don Machut. The old man appeared in the doorway, watching silently. His eyes traveled over every line of the painting, every spot, every shadow. Gabriel waited for her reaction with his heart pounding. Finally, Don Machut smiled with satisfaction. Yes, now, Gabriel, he said quietly. This is you. The painting was still there, in front of him, like a naked mirror. Gabriel knew he had crossed a threshold. He had painted without fear, but showing it to the world was another story. And then the call came from his agent. Gabriel, I need you to tell me that you already have something ready for the exhibition, said Marcos, his agent, with his usual impatient tone. The gallery wants more of your vibrant landscapes. The last series sold out in days. Gabriel pressed the phone. He looked at his new work. Dark, raw, different from anything I had done before. I have something. But it's not what you expect. There was silence on the other end of the line. What does that mean? That it is not commercial. It's not pretty. But it's mine. Mark sighed. Look, Gabriel, you know how this works. Art is also a business. If you go too far off track, People might not understand it and not buy it. Gabriel felt a pang in his chest. The same fear as always, not being accepted. "Give me a day to decide," he replied before hanging up. He sank into his chair, exhausted. It was the most difficult decision of his life. That night he couldn't sleep. He was torn between two paths. Follow the safe formula. Give the gallery what it wanted, what had always sold well. Take risks. Show his new work, even if it meant rejection, even if it meant losing everything he had worked for. He remembered himself. As a child, keeping his drawing of the forest in a drawer, convincing himself that it wasn't good enough. Was I really going to do the same thing again? He took his phone and called Marcos. "I'm going to exhibit my new work." His agent was slow to respond. "You're sure?" Gabriel closed his eyes and took a deep breath. More than ever, the gallery was full. Warm lights, glasses of wine, the hum of elegant conversations. Gabriel watched the people as they walked among his oldest paintings. Beautiful landscapes, clean lines, vibrant colors. Everything that had been accepted before. And then, at the back of the room, his new work. The dark forest, the shadows. The child in the center. Every step someone took towards her made Gabriel's heart beat harder. He felt exposed, vulnerable. He watched the first visitor stop in front of the painting. There were furrowed eyebrows. Murmurs. An older man cocked his head in confusion. Terror passed through him. What have I done? Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I ruined my career. Marcos approached him with a tense expression. "Well, it's definitely a change of direction." Gabriel swallowed. "Is that good or bad?" "It depends on who looks at it." Gabriel tried not to listen to the comments. Some people stayed in front of the painting for only a few seconds before moving on. Others stopped for longer. And then he saw a young woman who was not moving. His breathing was labored, as if the paint had hit something deep inside him. He approached slowly. She became aware of his presence and looked at him with bright eyes. "Is it yours?" Gabriel nodded, not knowing what to say. The woman swallowed before speaking. "I don't know why, but it reminds me of something I felt when I was a child. Something I could never put into words." Gabriel felt a lump in his throat. She looked back at the painting and smiled weakly. "Thank you for doing this." She walked away, leaving him with a feeling he had never experienced before. It was not the empty praise of an art critic. It was something real. His painting had touched someone. And at that moment he understood. It didn't matter if not everyone understood it. It didn't matter if it didn't sell. For the first time in his life, he had painted something that really mattered. And that was more valuable than any external recognition. Hours later, when the exhibition ended, Gabriel left the gallery with a feeling of relief and fear at the same time. Marcos approached him with his hands in his pockets. "I don't know what will happen after this," he said sincerely. "But I respect you for what you did." Gabriel nodded. "I didn't know what would happen either, but I did know one thing. He would never hide his truth again." And at that moment he understood. It didn't matter if not everyone understood it. It didn't matter if it didn't sell. For the first time in his life, he had painted something that really mattered. And that was more valuable than any external recognition. Hours later, when the exhibition ended, Gabriel left the gallery with a feeling of relief and fear at the same time. Marcos approached him with his hands in his pockets. "I don't know what will happen after this," he said sincerely. "But I respect you for what you did." Gabriel nodded. "I didn't know what would happen either, but I did know one thing. He would never hide his truth again." Gabriel swallowed. The man, with his gaze fixed on the work, seemed to be somewhere else, lost in his own memories. Finally she turned to him. "You are the artist, right?" Gabriel nodded. The man smiled sadly. "Thank you." Gabriel frowned, confused. "Because?" The man took a breath, as if it were difficult for him to speak. "Because years ago, I lost my son." Gabriel felt a blow to his chest. "This painting... double quote." The man continued. I don't know why, but when I saw him, I felt like he was talking to me, as if someone had finally painted what I have inside. Silence fell between the two. Gabriel felt his eyes burn. The man patted him on the shoulder and walked away, with a relieved expression, as if he had found something he had been looking for years. Gabriel looked at his work. Suddenly, the criticism didn't matter. He had touched something in someone. His art, his truth, had found an echo in another human being. That was the true purpose, and he understood. It wasn't about everyone liking me. It was about reaching those who really needed to see it. Gabriel took a deep breath, and for the first time in his career, he felt free. Gabriel stood in front of his painting, watching how people reacted. Some ignored it. Others watched him with bewilderment. And yet, there was one person who was deeply touched by his work. That was enough. For the first time in his life, he felt something he had never experienced in art: freedom. I didn't have to please everyone. I didn't have to follow a formula. He didn't have to sell himself to be recognized. He had spent years chained to external approval, painting what people expected, what buyers asked of him, what the industry demanded of him. But now something inside him, it was broken and rebuilt at the same time. That night, after the exhibition, he walked through the city aimlessly. The lights of the cars seemed to reflect their own internal chaos. He knew something was dying inside him. The Gabriel who sought validation. The Gabriel who was afraid to disappoint. The Gabriel who painted for others and not for himself. The echo of his past hit him hard. His mother's voice. Paint something pretty. Your agent's voice. Give people what they expect. The voice of the critics. This is too dark. And then he felt the emptiness. The void that he had always tried to fill with success, with fame, with acceptance. But in that emptiness, there was a rebirth, because for the first time it felt real. He arrived at his studio at dawn. He stood at the door, looking at his past works, vibrant colors, calculated shapes, designs made to sell, not to feel. He approached one of his most famous paintings, the one that had been on the cover of magazines, the one that people adored. She looked at him with different eyes. It wasn't him. It never was. And then, in a rush, he grabbed it and put it on the ground. He took a deep breath, picked up a brush, and covered it in black. Each stroke was a farewell, a funeral for the artist he had been. With each brushstroke, he felt something release inside him. When he finished, he turned away and saw the canvas now covered in darkness. A new beginning. He sat in front of a blank canvas. And this time, he thought of nothing but his truth. He took the brush, and he started painting again. Gabriel did not know what fate awaited him. Maybe I would lose contracts. Maybe his new work wouldn't sell. Maybe many people wouldn't understand it. But for the first time in his life, he didn't care, because now I knew who it was. And his art, finally, it was real. The sun streamed through the studio window, illuminating the remains of the old paintings. The traces of his artistic past were there, but now they were just that, past. In front of him, a new canvas. This time, there was no pressure, there was no fear, there was no intention to please. Just him and the truth he had inside. He picked up a paintbrush and, without much thought, let his hand move. Each stroke was free. Every color was honest. There were no schemes or formulas. There was no market or expectations. Just Gabriel. Painting, for the first time in his life, without fear. The days passed, and Gabriel continued painting with this new perspective. He didn't know if his new works would sell. He didn't know if his audience would accept it. But what I did know, it was finally authentic. And that made him feel alive. One afternoon, Don Macias went to visit him. He stood at the door of the study, observing the canvases scattered around the room. Gabriel looked at him nervously. He had always valued his teacher's opinion. Don Macias approached one of the paintings and contemplated it in silence. A few minutes passed. Then he smiled. Now you are painting. Gabriel felt a lump in his throat. It was the first time. Anyone had seen his art, no masks, and recognized it for what it was. Not because of his technique, not because of his style, but for the truth it contained. That recognition, it was more valuable than any prize. Gabriel realized that his life was changing too. He no longer felt the need to compare himself to other artists. He no longer feared rejection. He no longer sought external approval to validate his art. Its success was no longer measured in numbers, sales, or recognition. It was measured in something much deeper: his connection with himself. He had gone through the fire of self-knowledge, and he had come out transformed. Now, everything he created would carry his true essence. And that was more powerful than any passing trend. The camera moves slowly through Gabriel's studio. The canvases now tell different stories. Real stories. The city lights flicker through the window as he looks at his latest completed work. It's not perfect, does not follow trends, but it's yours. For years, I painted to be accepted, to fit in, to meet expectations that weren't even mine. But in that process, I forgot the most important thing: accept myself. I had to destroy what I thought I was, to find what I really am. Individuation is not an easy path. It is not fast. It is not comfortable. But it is the most necessary trip. The camera slowly zooms in on its new frame. The background music becomes more intense, as if something is about to be revealed. Gabriel turns and looks at the camera, straight into the viewer's eyes. And then, he drops the question: how many things in your life do you do for others, and not for yourself? Silence. The image fades to black. The credits begin to roll slowly, and the screen turns off.